general understanding that we already achieved the 15th or the free bands, and those things happen thanks to those. Very much people is having the perception that they are opening, they are doing new things, and in fact we are already enjoying some of the results that happen because of that. There's still lots of things to do, and that let's make the open spectrum audience very useful. But for instance, talking in particular in one of the part of the people, I would say, it's very important to be open to many different kind of communities. And there could be several types, and one of course, are the ham users that they provide. They tend to be people from, I'm in the generation in the middle, right? I'm in the 40s. There are people, they used to be retired people, right? That have lots of plenty time with very good antenna places, locations. And yeah, and sometimes I have seen some kind of controversy since they have been licensed. Some of them maybe don't like the unlicensed concept because they have to fight for your point. So, okay, now you give a license to everybody. And this kind of controversies from time to time, they happen. But for sure, I mean, there is a lot of connection. They love antennas, they love radio, and it's a good example of interaction between communities and a group of users that can be really, really very helpful in many things. And particularly regarding the knowledge of antennas is awesome in some cases, and how to transmit the signal very far. And maybe they are not that good in this, and they have, since they are retired, they have a lot of time to, and they are really very social and you know, nice people. So yeah, maybe we are not many times recognizing this work that had been done during the 80s and the 90s that I heard about. So I was very you know, pleased for and it's actually very useful to have people like Bob on board, right, in the spectrum audience.
So this is all a prologue to the spectrum policy hacking of yesteryear. Why don't we dive into some of the key spectrum hacking points of today? Maybe Steve, you get us started, just give me a bit of context and what you see in your work in South Africa and beyond.
Sure. So I have to say I entered the world of spectrum policy quite naively, with a lot more optimism than I have here this morning. In that, you know, I thought simply lobbying for more spectrum commons would be a good thing to facilitate, you know, more innovation, more participation, and more shared space in networks. And first of all, I think, you know, it's a little bit arcane for people, you know, that policy making in general, you know, attracts a sort of narrow subsection of people, and then spectrum policy itself is quite specialized. So actually finding a critical mass of people, especially in, you know, in South Africa or other African countries, to actually, you know, motivate and talk about this is quite a struggle. So one of the things I was kind of hoping to get into today was, you know, what are the elements we can make common cause about? What are the elements that, you know, where are the weak points in spectrum policy that where we can put pressure on to bring about change? Because it is evident to me that change doesn't really happen nationally. I mean, you know, the spectrum policy is so woven into, well, two things: into the ITU and into technology manufacturers. You know, if your technology manufacturer isn't manufacturing a device that works in the spectrum band you're interested in, I mean, it's irrelevant. So those two things, you know, that if you don't have devices that work in, you know, if you don't have TV white spaces devices, well, TV white spaces is just a theoretically interesting thing. Could you talk a little bit about TV white spaces? Sure.
First, talk about how the open
Well, so we have an open spectrum alliance. It's kind of a smaller one than the European one in South Africa, and that was a collaboration between my foundation and the Wireless Access Providers Association. So that's the sort of that's the opportunity, really. I think in most countries is where you get the the wireless ISPs that have formed associations, and they're the ones that are going to think creatively about influencing spectrum policy. I think and that was another learning point for me, because they're not that interested in the spectrum commons. They're busy exploiting the spectrum commons even as we speak, but they're more interested in regimes with more control. So regimes that give them as an association more control. So like licensing regimes where they take they take responsibility for a certain spectrum band, and then as an association manage the allocation of spectrum. So, and that's been the learning process for me, is sort of learning that that in fact there are a range of solutions that fit different contexts, and if you want people to invest large amounts of money, they're going to want assurances of certain guarantees of performance in terms of the spectrum they're using. So there are solutions for the grassroots, and there are solutions for the larger investors, and trying to find those points to push on. So one of the things that the Wireless Access Providers Association in South Africa has been doing was looking at the 5 gigahertz band, which in South Africa it's got about there's sort of 4 different unlicensed and licensed bands that. Because technology like MikroTik routers, you can basically tune them to work in any piece of the spectrum. This, the regulations are being pretty substantially flouted in South Africa, to the point where it's attracting complaints from the South African Weather Service, who use that spectrum for their weather Doppler radar. But so I mean. That was one thing that occurred to me, was that maybe there's an opportunity for sort of like harmonizing the commons in places where it's not completely harmonized. So in that whole range of sort of 5 to 5.8 gigahertz, it varies across countries. The IRPs vary, the ranges that's licensed, and that simply trying to expand that into a common harmonized framework might be a good, an interesting pressure point as a kind of first step. Sorry, I'm sort of wandering all over the place, but that has sort of been my experience in looking at spectrum, is really trying to understand it from a wide variety of lenses to look for where's the point where we can push that we're likely to get some movement, because it is evident to me that this is a very, very not intractable but difficult problem, simply because of the it takes years for manufacturers to start building devices, and it takes decades for the ITU to move forward on policy.
You want to add to that?
Well, yeah, Steve brought up several very important points. I wanted just to kind of draw them out, because you asked to shift now to the current spectrum issues. The discovery that there's a regulatory space between licensed and unlicensed is a major development. When people first started to talk about open spectrum, say 20 years ago, the idea was that it might be possible to move to a completely unregulated regime, like the human voice is a largely unregulated medium. And it was a utopian concept for a long time, and I think many of the first generation of open spectrum activists saw licensed versus unlicensed as a choice, a binary choice, essentially, between 2 alternatives. But in the last few years, regulators have recognized that there are lots of intermediary authorization classes that Steve's talking about, licensing being the sort of family name for all of these, where you might have a registration process, but not the kind of specification of service that a normal license requires. Or what the British have come up with, something called recognized spectrum rights. These are for passive services like radio astronomy that don't issue signals at all, but they do have spectrum rights still. Anyway, this is a whole game-changing development, the idea that there can be these intermediary authorization classes between licensed and unlicensed. And it's something which I think the community wireless people have to get involved in thinking through, because it's no longer clear what is the best regime for something like a community network. Just the example that Steve gave of the WISPA, the wireless ISPs, preferring a bit more control than simply the free-for-all that you have in Wi-Fi. That's a kind of natural business impulse, and will be even stronger when WiMAX starts to spread, because WiMAX doesn't share spectrum very well. So anyway, I would hope that people would start thinking at this kind of conference, what is the best regulatory regime? We know that licensing is probably not the best regulatory regime for community wireless, because you lose a lot of the flexibility that licenses don't allow for when you have to reconfigure your network or change your coverage area, or change to a different kind of antenna, or even as Italy found, when you start to issue licenses, the license area may not exactly align with the boundaries of an urban area. You may find that the only people who are interested in the license are your neighbors in the next town over, but you yourself don't have a critical mass to apply for the license. So anyway, I think that in the community wireless space, some harder thinking about what the optimum regulatory regime in terms of licensing versus unlicensing really has to start.
Well, that brings up in my mind a great question, which is if each of you were sort of the grand poobahs of spectrum licensing, the benevolent dictator of licensure in each of your countries, what would be the mandate that you would pass on from on high to get things started with this sort of new regimes of licensing? Like, what's the first thing you guys would do?
I think regarding to following this community wireless networks, what they don't like is have to go through legal things to obtain licenses. This is what I heard about the concept of licensing the spectrum. That should be free, easy to entry to it. And on the other side, and so we can distinguish between those two problems. We hate when somebody sets up a baby cam, made in China, that is using also 2.4 spectrum, and through an area about 100 meters, it drops everything off. It's what? So don't create licensing because of those baby cams. This baby cam was manufactured by somebody, and maybe is still using an analogic way of transmitting the signal that overlaps several channels for just transmitting a poor video signal. So who is allowing them to manufacture this kind of, let's say, not efficient use, is not efficiently using the spectrum, or is using in a way that it's supposed to be done 10 years ago. But right now there is enough technology to avoid that. So we expect from the regulators, and the authorities, not to create barriers to let the people enter and use the spectrum. And they have to be much more worried in terms of the manufacturers, the best practices that apply it, and when building those kind of devices. So they have to regulate a different thing, not regulate in a way that they are creating difficulties to entry points. So let's make as much as possible the spectrum free to get used by everybody, but applying best practices and focus on that. So what the manufacturers are doing, looking at efficient use. Why we are building the TVs in a certain way? If there is all the white spaces thing that we maybe really if nobody manufactures those TVs, yeah, but we are then missing a huge opportunity of more efficiently. So they have to be forced. Let's say if you want to manufacture a TV, let's do it that way, unless you will not be able to build the materials. So maybe the licenses should take a look, or the regulatory should take a look to another let's say pieces of the problem.
So is it safe to say then that you would mandate technical specs that would ensure that the manufacturing of devices that were a lot more dynamic than what we have today?
And that should be the main, that should be the main focus of the regulators, if you ask me, and from the community point of view.
translated and that sort of thing to avoid competition.
And block others for using the spectrum. It needs to be changed in the way that is
Steve, Bob, and Alex.
Yeah.
So for me, I mean, where I live, it all comes down to the cost of access and how to drive down the cost of access. So my interest in spectrum really sort of all revolves around that. And you know, what would help bring that about? So right now, the fact that the mobile operators have a lock on the spectrum that the most popular devices in the world use, 900, 1800 to the 2100 megahertz. I mean, that's a huge barrier. For me, one of the most interesting things that has happened in the last 2 years has been the iPhone, and what the iPhone has done to telephone networks in the US. So 5 years ago in the US, Nokia were manufacturing mobile phones customized for the North American market without Wi-Fi, right? You know, it was the E51, the E52. The E52 was for the North American market, no Wi-Fi, because the operators didn't want Wi-Fi. Now, interesting, the pressure that the data use of, especially these unlimited plans of the iPhone, the pressure that it's put on the 3G networks. Now the operators see Wi-Fi and femtocells as a way of offloading capacity, which, you know, I don't think they realize how vulnerable they are to that strategy. And that I've forgotten the U.S. blogger who wrote about it. He said, you know, what if Apple started making Wi-Fi the default on their, you know, for everything, and then it would fall back? What if, you know, what if GSM was just like smoking? It was something you only did when you were outdoors. It's like, you know, if you know that, and we're already starting to see that kind of convergence. So Cherry Networks in Belgium, they have their mobile virtual network operator. They offer Converge. They have a little software client that uses their Wi-Fi networks first, and the GSM networks second. Internet Solutions in South Africa are just piloting the same technology. There are two emerging IEEE standards, 802.21 and 802.11u, that offer the potential to actually make this virtually integrated in every mobile device. So 802.21 is about heterogeneous handoff across networks. So right now you can do that with software, but if it was actually built right into the core of phones that you didn't actually have to think about whether you were on a Wi-Fi network or a GSM network, that would mean interesting things that could happen. Sorry.
Well, if I could just mention an interesting conversation. I'm not a technology, so I have to back you, but I was talking with somebody who is a senior manager in one of the Far Eastern manufacturers of handsets, which basically is supplied through the mobile operators. And they are increasingly frustrated. HTC, of course, have broken loose and gone direct to the market. But these people are saying, gosh, you know, we're slaves to these operators. And I'm having a discussion with him about the fact that he was explaining that the density of mobile handsets now are such that you can actually provide a mesh network.
Yes, that's right.
And you know, when's the time going to come when one of these ingenious, frustrated, whatever you like to call them, handset manufacturers actually approaches one or